This exhibition features the artists of post-revolutionary Mexico and their active roles in political, social, and artistic circles. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera were at the forefront of the Mexican modernist movement and nurtured circles of influence amongst artists, intellectuals, and patrons. Visitors to the exhibition will be greeted by the beautiful calla lily vendor by Diego Rivera. In this painting, two women kneel before a basket overflowing with flowers. This work is both beautiful and subversive. Rivera painted this subject often, and its symbolism encompasses some of the political concerns of his day. Those in particular are agrarian labor, land rights, and class struggle. Two young women kneel in the foreground, and their bare feet, rebosos or shawls, and braided hair indicate they are indigenous or mestizo women from the countryside. The flowers also obscure a man, and we can just barely see his hat at the top of the image. Now, calla lilies were not native to Mexico. At the time, they were cultivated for decorating the homes of the wealthy and for funerary wreaths. In Rivera's hands, the blooms evoke the abundance of life and death in Mexico, as well as the crushing burden placed upon the poor in service to the upper classes in his day. The story of the exhibition unfolds following the Mexican Revolution. It begins around 1920 when Mexico emerges from a civil war. The following decades brought about a cultural flourishing as Mexico worked to unite its people and build a new national identity. And we will see how artists were included in these efforts through such major themes in the exhibition like land, home, and family, circles of influence, shifting views, spectacular life, creating Frida, being Frida, and the marvelous real. Now, let me set the stage a little bit with some information about the Mexican Revolution. This was a complex, decade-long conflict sparked by calls for land and labor reform, for resource redistribution, for ending the exploitation of indigenous and agrarian peoples, and shaking off the influence of the United States and Europe. From 1910 to 1920, Mexico endured factional violence and civil war, beginning with the overthrow of dictator Porfirio Diaz, who had been in power since 1876. Regional forces formed under guerrilla fighters Pancho Villa to the north and Emiliano Zapata to the south, and those forces fought government armies amassed under urban generals and politicians like Victoriana Huerta and Francisco Madero, among others. The documentary images you see in this slide speak to the displacement of people across the country, the changing dynamics of alliances, and the widespread enlistment of militia, including some that involved women fighters known as the soldaderas. In 1920, Mexico emerged as a constitutional republic. Historic inequalities gave way to a new vision for a unified nation that combined pre-Hispanic traditions, colonial histories, and modern ideals. Artists were charged with visualizing this history and a new political identity called Mexicanidad, or Mexicanness. And I'm going to use that word often tonight, Mexicanidad, so hang on to that. As we will see, Mexican modernists depicted the unique characteristics of the land, its people, and the rich history of the country in murals, paintings, prints, and photographs. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera were the power couple at the center of this effort. The two portraits here by Kahlo communicate the artist's beliefs in progressive political ideologies. Kahlo depicts Rivera in a blue open-collared shirt, and in the exhibition, we'll see many photographs of him wearing a working man's attire of overalls or these blue shirts. And this wardrobe speaks to his position as an artist worker on par with other laborers. In her self-portrait, a beaded necklace is reminiscent of pre-Columbian jewelry and handicraft, and it marks her connection to the art and people before the Columbian conquest. Mexican modernist artists were activists during these decades. The most visible legacy of their efforts are the large-scale public murals sponsored by the new government, but they were also out in the streets and in political meetings. This photograph on the left of your screen captures Frida and Diego at a demonstration in Mexico City, fists raised amidst a crowd of like-minded protesters. Kahlo and Rivera were members of the Mexican Communist Party, and they joined others who positioned artists as workers fighting alongside industrial and agrarian laborers. The muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, seen here in a portrait from 1930, was also a labor organizer and wrote manifestos on behalf of the Union of Technical Workers, Painters, and Sculptors. He was amongst the most radical of the modernist artists, and here he depicts himself with a steadfast gaze and arms crossed high on his chest with fists clenched. The exhibition also reveals the multiple layers of Mexican modernism. Well, the Mexicanidad ideology and their political work formed many artists' core values. They also embraced stylistic innovations and participated in international conversations about what constitutes a truly modern art. For example, some experimented with avant-garde styles like Cubism. Rivera, in fact, spent several years in Paris as a young artist and developed an abstract style that we can see in the painting on the left called The Last Hour from 1915. And this is the earliest work in the exhibition. Here he's flattened the spatial perspective and created a still life of an open book, a newspaper, and other elements arranged on a table. Rivera was part of Pablo Picasso's circle during this time, although he quickly moved away from abstraction and embraced realism and figuration in his political work to come. These artistic dialogues with European and American artists continued for decades, especially for Kahlo and Rivera, who traveled extensively abroad. I love this photograph by Manuel Alvarez Bravo of Frida seated in an exhibition with a large Picasso work behind her. And I think it attests to how the avant-garde and this notion of Mexicanidad that we can see evidenced through her choice of clothing went hand in hand for these artists. Layers of history are a constant theme and a clear reminder of how the present is built upon the past, particularly in Mexico. Ancient art and pre-conquest indigenous histories served as aesthetic inspiration for communicating these unique characteristics of Mexicanidad. The exhibition features a suite of photographs by Guillermo Kahlo, who was Frida's father. These photographs document Mexico City's cathedral, which was built on top of the sacred site of the Aztec peoples. The image you see on your left shows ornately carved choir stalls dating to the colonialist era. The cathedral itself, and you'll see this in other photographs, was constructed over many centuries from the conquest onward. The modernist painter Günter Geertzow depicts geological and historical strata in archaic landscape, which you see on the right. Flat, abstract layers of rock, earth, and architectural elements communicate this idea of cultures being built one upon the other. Another section of the exhibition explores the important innovations of modernist photographers in Mexico, and we're calling this part of the exhibition Shifting Views. In the 1920s and 30s, international photographers and filmmakers came to Mexico to live and work, including the American Edward Weston, his partner, the Italian Tina Madati, and the Russian Sergei Eisenstein. They all came through Mexico and interacted with Mexican photographers, and together they advanced the artistic potential of the medium. The three works in this slide by Manuel Alvarez Bravo demonstrate the modernist aesthetics of abstraction, geometry, asymmetry, and strong contrasts. The negative image of a rolled mattress on the left becomes a study of line and contrast. The instruments in the center portrays an interest in the formal interplays of circles and arcs. And finally, on the left, the close-up view of organ pipe cacti captures a distinct element of the Mexican landscape through a play of light and shadow. Lola Alvarez Bravo, who was married to Manuel, chose to focus on life as she saw it. She championed rural communities and urban workers, as well as their diverse cultural practices. The two works in this slide speak to her approach that combined documentary with formal considerations. Shark Hunters, Acapulco, on the left, shows two men tugging a shark across the sand on a beach with a thick rope, while a third looks on in what I think is a beautiful contrapposto pose. The burial at Yalalag on the right captures a funerary procession in the mountainous terrain of Oaxaca and accentuates the traditional attire worn by women of the region. Now, Alvarez Bravo took great care to treat her subjects with respect as she joined them in their rituals and daily life and documented these activities. A key catalyst for the Mexican Revolution, as I described earlier, was the fight over land rights and the rights of indigenous and rural peoples. After the revolution, Mexican modernist artists turned towards depicting the land as a shared place of unique beauty, where people experienced a continuum of religious, cultural, social, and spiritual events dating to pre-Hispanic times. I think we see some of that in Lola Alvarez Bravo's wonderful photographs that we just saw, but we also have this iconic work by Diego Rivera. Here he populates the arid Mexican landscape with cacti who look distinctly human. Branches become gesturing arms that extend from sturdy trunks, and some have even speculated that the lively trio in the foreground represent the artist, his wife, Frida Kahlo, and her lover, the photographer, Nicholas Marai. Now, Rivera's life often found its way into his work, even when he was creating allegorical scenes. By choosing the cactus, a symbol of the Mexican nation, Rivera connected the landscape with ideas of independence and Mexicanidad. And as I'm sure many of you know, the national flag of Mexico features a cactus and an eagle holding a snake in its beak. The plants, animals, and landscapes of Mexico were strong symbols of Mexicanidad for the modernist artists. In Self-Portrait with Monkeys, Kahlo depicts herself surrounded by large green leaves, a bird of paradise flower, and a coterie of monkeys, perhaps her own pets. She did have two monkeys as pets. She wears a huipil, a type of blouse worn by indigenous women. The red knot-like symbol at the neckline resembles the Aztec glyph Oyin, which means earthquake or perpetual movement in Nahuatl, an Aztecan language. Upheaval was constant in Kahlo's life, whether in her marriage to Rivera, her chronic pain caused by illness and injury, or her life at the center of activist and artistic circles. Nonetheless, she pictures herself in this verdant environment to establish a connection with the continuity of nature that she saw as a bedrock of Mexican culture. The traditions of home and family are another important subject matter that expressed Mexicanidad for the modernist artists. The home is seen as a place that provides sustenance and care while nurturing community and shared identity. Rivera emphasizes traditional dress and furnishings in the painting of Modesta on the right side of the screen. Modesta was a daughter of Delfina Flores, who worked in Rivera's home, and she sits on a woven and painted chair wearing a huipil blouse. In a work like Healer on the left, Rivera depicts a man dressed in modest clothing and sandals, attending to an injured boy who's wriggling in a woman's arms. Instead of a doctor's medicine bag, we see other wares, perhaps botanicals and tinctures of a more traditional type of healing. And it suggests a tradition that's quickly disappearing from a modernizing society. Home and family were significant themes in both Frida and Diego's art, despite their unconventional marriage. They separated, divorced, and remarried, and were not monogamous. They lived together on and off in Frida's childhood home, known as La Casa Azul, in the neighborhood of Coyoacan in Mexico City. La Casa Azul is now the Frida Kahlo Museum, and we see a picture of it on the left, the courtyard, interior courtyard and garden of this wonderful place. Several photographs in the exhibition document Frida's life here. In the photograph on the right, her friend Florence Arkin captures the artist in her garden. Frida's home was her studio, as well as a hub of political and social activity. Significantly, it was the place where Frida could live on her own terms as a disabled queer woman at a time when Mexican society expected women to be dutiful wives and mothers. The exhibition also explores circles of influence that Frida and Diego cultivated throughout their lives. Through photographs, we get a glimpse at Frida and Diego's loving and complicated relationship in this section. Kahlo's parents famously described the match as a marriage between an elephant and a dove. And I think this dynamic is clear in Martin Munkaci's beautiful portrait of the two, pairing her delicate features with his imposing face. Their partnership included artistic competition and interpersonal conflicts, but also devoted companionship and a shared commitment to leftist politics. Despite the volatility of their marriage, as I mentioned, they separated, divorced, and were remarried. They still maintained a deep admiration for each other's art and for each other. And this photograph on the left shows them sharing a tender kiss following their second wedding. After the Mexican Revolution, Mexico City became a vibrant cultural center that attracted international artists, intellectuals, political activists, and arts patrons. Among the foreigners flocking to Mexico at the time were the film producer Jacques Gelman and his future wife, Natasha Zahalkaha, who both immigrated from Eastern Europe before World War II. The exhibition also tells the story of this particular power couple. After they married, the Gelmans soon became important in Mexico's extended social and cultural circles. With the success of his film production company, they were able to commission and collect works by the foremost modern artists in Mexico of the day. In Angel Zaraga's portrait of Jacques Gelman on your left, we see the producer sitting on a film set surrounded by theater lights and stage hands, indicating his important position within the film industry and community. Frida Kahlo's portrait of Natasha Gelman on the right depicts a rather stern blonde woman with tight curls and a fur stole. Now, reportedly, the two did not hit it off very well at all, but later became very close friends, and Natasha became a good friend as well as patron of Frida throughout her life. Most of the artworks in the exhibition are drawn from the Gelmans' extensive collection. As I just mentioned, Natasha was a significant supporter of Frida as well as Diego Rivera. In his portrait of her, Rivera again paints the calla lilies. The sexually suggestive blooms here echo the white gown that hugs her curves and that opens teasingly below her knees. She's almost a starlet in one of Gelman's films that he produces. And I think it's quite a contrast to the Kahlo portrait of her, and also quite a contrast to how Rivera employed the flowers in another symbolic way in the calla lily vendor that we saw earlier. Of course, this vibrant cultural scene in Mexico City was also a political hotbed. The theme, Spirit of the People, looks at Frida and Diego's activism. There are many photographs included in this section, including the one on the left, which shows Frida and Diego photographed at the New Workers School in New York City around the time that Rivera was working on his ill-fated mural at Rockefeller Center. The middle image of Frida by Florence Arkeen shows her late in life, proudly revealing the hammer and sickle that denotes proletarian solidarity that she's drawn onto her body cast. Other works in this section speak to Kahlo's strong views against capitalism. In this small drawing, it might be hard to make out on your screen, but the Statue of Liberty holds a bag of money and her torch is replaced by an atomic bomb. So quite a strong statement. This section will also touch on the mural movement, which played an important aesthetic and educational role within the early days of the Mexican Republic. The government's intention was to establish narratives of Mexican history that united indigenous cultures, the independence movement, and the current political ideologies. Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros were known as the Big Three, Los Tres Grandes, and they were awarded many mural commissions in public buildings. And their work resulted in a modern version of history painting that promoted the desired narratives of the post-revolutionary government. Because the murals were created as frescoes embedded into the surrounding architecture, we won't have one in the exhibition, but I did want to share this ambitious work by Rivera called Man, Controller of the Universe, to show the scale and grandeur of these projects. Not only did the muralists interpret historical events in their work, they often presented allegories of power, conflict, growth, and transformation, all of which can be seen in this mural that Rivera painted in the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City in 1934. As I explained, we won't have a mural in the exhibition, but we will have illustrations of important scenes drawn from Rivera's mural imagery. We're also able to bring prints from the museum's collection into the exhibition, particularly a suite by Jose Clemente Orozco, that likewise detail some of his important mural projects. Prints were a medium for disseminating the current political ideology and values of Mexicanidad to a broad public. Orozco's Women's March on the left depicts the important role that women played in supporting the fighters. We see them here carrying supplies and behind the lines in support of two soldiers who fade into the background of the print. The print on the right, Los Zapatistas, shows a mass of followers of the legendary general Emiliano Zapata. Here, the men's faces are drawn by hunger, exhaustion, and trauma, revealing the sacrifices and madness of war. While the muralists look to the past for historical and allegorical narratives, other Mexican modernists were fascinated with everyday life as a subject matter. The exhibition theme of spectacular life reveals artist reflections on the vibrancy of Mexican cities and towns, where festivals, ceremonies, and markets drew people out into public spaces. Now, in the first half of the 20th century, there was probably no other place like the cinema to get out and experience spectacle. And Rufino Tamayo depicts the wildly popular movie star Cantinflas in this painting that you see on the left from the viewpoint of the seats inside a movie theater. Actor Mario Moreno played this character, who was well known and well loved for his physical humor and his great play with language. And his producer was none other than Jacques Gelman. In the painting on the right, The Bride from Pantla, Maria Izquierdo paints a young woman on her wedding day. Her stiff, traditional clothing is in stark contrast to the colorful natural world around her. The scene speaks to the customs of Mexican society and religious beliefs that prized wifely virtue and motherhood as the proper role for women. Both works draw upon the ideas of Mexicanidad in the way that they communicate the uniqueness of Mexican cultural practices and lived experiences. Photography by Lola and Manuel Alvarez Bravo is threaded throughout the exhibition. And here we see two images of carousel horses that capture the fun and frivolity of modern amusements. In Lola Alvarez Bravo's photograph in particular, we see a whirlwind of a scene, a young girl astride one of the wooden horses, and she nearly blends into the patterns and decoration of the background in this charming photograph. Now, as we've discussed, Jacques and Natasha Gelman played an important role in supporting Frida Kahlo by collecting and commissioning work from her. This exhibition, which is drawn from their collection, is also particularly rich in exploring Frida Kahlo's biography, her politics, and how she actively shaped her public persona. Frida understood the power of photography to shape and share her image. She was particularly canny in understanding how others would perceive her through these pictures. I mean, after all, she was the daughter of a portrait photographer and assisted him in his studio when she was young. In the section we're calling Creating Frida, we have a timeline of photographs from 1929 to 1950. That's a wonderful documentation of the evolution of her personal style, particularly how she wore the dresses, blouses, headpieces, and shawls of indigenous women, as well as handcrafts dating to pre-Hispanic times. And these choices formed a forthright gesture of Mexicanidad ideals for her. In the exhibition, you will see a selection of contemporary dresses and accessories that reflect the traditional garments that Kahlo may have worn. Kahlo was the daughter of a German father and a Mexican mother who had indigenous roots, and she embraced this mestizo heritage in her life and in her art, as we are seeing. But it's also important, I think, to recognize that she was a woman of privilege who was part of the social elite. And we look back from our vantage point today, we might see her choices verging on cultural appropriation, yet at her time, they expressed this deeply held commitment to Mexicanidad identity. She wore styles of clothing that originated in her country and were not imported from Europe or the United States. One could also argue that this was a way for her to recognize women as they lived in broad swaths of Mexico, even if she was from a different background. And I think this is such an important aspect of her biography, and it's what makes her so interesting to us today. Kahlo embraced a strong personal identity marked by her mestizo heritage, her liberated bisexuality, and her desire for artistic freedom at a time when women did not have many rights and freedoms. Certainly today, we admire her as a revolutionary artist and a feminist. In her day, she could make choices other women couldn't because of her privileged socioeconomic status. This pair of self-portraits from 1941, to my eyes, reflect two sides of her life. In self-portrait with red and gold dress, she appears rather formal. Her tightly braided hair echoed in the fine details of her huipil blouse. Here, she presents herself in a reserved, maybe matronly manner, gazing out at us with pursed lips. In self-portrait with braid, she places herself amidst nature, again represented by this lush green foliage. We see Kahlo's bare shoulders and an elaborate crown of braids and ribbons. Her necklace includes pre-Columbian carvings. Now it's that same gaze that's extending out from the canvas, but the feeling projected from this portrait is open and spirited. Of course, a close companion to creating Frida is being Frida. Her debilitated health was a constant and at times overwhelming strain. Many people identify so strongly with her as a hero and a role model because of her path-breaking queerness and her resilience in the face of chronic pain and disability. As a child, she had polio, and later as a teen, she sustained life-altering injuries in a terrible bus accident. In this photograph, Frida sits in a wheelchair with her physician, Dr. Fariel, standing beside her. We see them in her studio in front of a panel that depicts Frida seated in a wheelchair, painting a portrait of Dr. Fariel. An image such as this says so much, I think, about her wit and her unabashed approach to depicting herself as she was. The exhibition contains several compelling works that also reveal how Frida represented herself enduring the grueling health conditions that were with her throughout her life. In Self-Portrait on Bed, which you see on your left, the young artist sits on a simple cot with a baby doll beside her. Kahlo wrote and spoke about her desire to have a child with Rivera. She had an abortion and miscarriages, and some speculate that this doll in this work represents a lost child. But I wonder about that cigarette in her hand. It's a tiny detail, but to me, it suggests a modern woman, maybe one drawn to, but still at odds with the role of being a mother. In works like the untitled print on the right side of your screen, she shows herself divided. One half of her body is light and the other is shaded. One side supports the life of a fetus, the other drips blood onto the ground and nourishes plants. The work, to me, represents her struggle between the desire for motherhood and her identity as an artist, which we can see represented in the heart-shaped palette that dominates the top right corner of the print. And certainly this piece can attest to what Kahlo once famously said, "I never paint dreams or nightmares. I paint my own reality." The work of Kahlo and other Mexican modernist artists does hold a surrealist sensibility. Many artists created scenes and motifs that speak to a seamless fluidity between the real and the imagined, the modernizing present and the ancient past. To address this theme, we are grouping works under the banner of the marvelous real. And this term comes from the Cuban author Alejo Carpentier, who coined the phrase lo real maravilloso in the 1930s to describe the development of an artistic vision that combined multiple views of reality and fantasy. In the painting on your left, Maria Izquierdo crowds a still life into the foreground of this piece, living nature. A wall on the right half of the painting recedes sharply into the pictorial space, and it runs parallel to a row of dead trees on the left side of the painting. The cloudy sky appears turbulent, a portent of change echoed in the memento mori of rotting fruits. In Kahlo's painting on the right, an abundance of fresh fruit sits atop a table and a tiny doll on the left side of the painting. She's dwarfed by the juicy seed-filled watermelon and papaya in front of her. And these works are rife with symbolism as the artists transformed the real materials at their disposal into meditations on sex and death. Two incredible works by Kahlo anchor this concluding chapter of the exhibition. These paintings, I think, especially reflect how her life held space for multiple possibilities. The the love embrace of the universe, the earth, Mexico, myself, Diego, and Senor Xolotl unites her own view of the universe, presented as balancing forces of light and dark, sun and moon. The flourishing earth of Mexico, personified as a woman with earth-toned skin and mother's milk, embraces Kahlo, who then cradles Rivera. Rivera is depicted as a child and a grown man with a third eye to suggest Buddha-like wisdom. At this time, Frida wrote in her journal of her maternal feelings for her spouse, quote, "At every moment he is my child born every moment, daily from myself." This intensely layered love pyramid even includes Frida's dog, Senor Xolotl, curled amongst the lush greenery in the lower left of the painting. Xolotl is also the name of the Aztec god associated with the realm of death. The work creates a circle of simultaneous birth, love, life, and death. And the final work I want to share with you tonight is one of the most famous paintings by Kahlo, Diego on My Mind, Self-Portrait as Tijuana. Painted 6 years before the love embrace, this work speaks to Kahlo's strong desire for and obsession with Rivera. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, neither was monogamous, and that created heightened jealousy and tumult in their relationship. And many interpret this painting with this emotional tone. Rivera is etched into her forehead, suggesting that he has become a part of her. He is always with her. And significantly, Kahlo depicts herself wearing a starched lace headdress from Tehuantepec in the state of Oaxaca, Kahlo's maternal ancestors were of this region, known for its matriarchal society where women held power in the family and in the marketplace. Kahlo celebrated this alternative to the Mexican patriarchy by consciously presenting herself as a Tehuana, by presenting herself in this guise, inscribed the complex layers contained within herself. She's both betrothed yet independent, burdened yet powerful. And I think this work encompasses beautifully the major undercurrent of this exhibition, how the coexistence of multiple layers of history and culture were central to the work of Mexican modernist artists. The art of this time, and what we'll soon see in the exhibition, enabled artists to imagine their personal world and experiences in unity with a growing national identity and independence built on a very special history. The exhibition offers a window into this incredibly resonant moment, and I really look forward to opening it to you all on February 19th.